but not by ambush, not the coward's way. Nothing unsportsmanlike. His parents had always taught him to go by the rules. Fezzik stood in the shadow, the great rock tight in his great hand. He could hear the footsteps of the man in black coming nearer. Nearer. Fezzik leapt from hiding and threw the rock with incredible power and perfect accuracy. It smashed into a boulder a foot away from the face of the man in black. "I did that on purpose," Fezzik said then, picking up another rock, holding it ready. "I didn't have to miss." "I believe you," the man in black said. They stood facing each other on the narrow mountain path. "Now what happens?" asked the man in black. "We face each other as God intended," Fezzik said. "No tricks, no weapons, skill against skill alone." "You mean you'll put down your rock and I'll put down my sword and we'll try to kill each other like civilized people, is that it?" "If you'd rather, I can kill you now," Fezzik said gently, and he raised the rock to throw. "I'm giving you a chance." "So you are, and I accept it," said the man in black, and he began to take off his sword and scabbard. "Although, frankly, I think the odds are slightly in your favor at hand fighting." "I tell you what I tell everybody," Fezzik explained. "I cannot help being the biggest and strongest. It's not my fault." "I'm not blaming you," said the man in black. "Let's get to it then," Fezzik said, and he dropped his rock and got into fighting position, watching as the man in black slowly moved toward him. For a moment, Fezzik felt almost wistful. This was clearly a good fellow, even if he had killed Inigo. He didn't complain or try and beg or bribe. He just accepted his fate. No complaining. Nothing like that. Obviously a criminal of character. Was he a criminal, though, Fezzik wondered? Surely the mask would indicate that. Or was it worse than that? Was he disfigured? His face burned away by acid, perhaps, or perhaps born hideous. "Why do you wear a mask and a hood?" Fezzik asked. "I think everybody will in the near future," was the man in black's reply. "They're terribly comfortable." They faced each other on the mountain path. There was a moment's pause. Then they engaged. Fezzik let the man in black fiddle around for a bit, tested the man's strength, which was considerable for someone who wasn't a giant. He let the man in black feint and dodge and try to hold here, a hold there. Then, when he was quite sure the man in black would not go to his maker embarrassed, Fezzik locked his arms tight around. Fezzik lifted and squeezed and squeezed. Then he took the remains of the man in black, snapped him one way, snapped him the other, cracked him with one hand in the neck, with the other at the spine base, locked his legs up, rolled his limp arms around them, and tossed the entire bundle of what had once been human into a nearby crevice. That was the theory, anyway. In fact, what happened was this. Fezzik lifted and squeezed, and the man in black slipped free. Thought Fezzik, that certainly was a surprise. I thought for sure I had him. "You're very quick," Fezzik complimented. "And a good thing, too," said the man in black. Then they engaged again. This time Fezzik did not give the man in black a chance to fiddle. He just grabbed him, swung him around his head once, twice, smashed his skull against the nearest boulder, pounded him, pummeled him, gave him a final squeeze for good measure, and tossed the remains of what once had been alive into a nearby crevice. Those were his intentions, anyway. In actuality, he never even got through the grabbing part with much success, because no sooner had Fezzik's great hands reached out than the man in black dropped and spun and twisted and was loose and free and still quite alive. "I don't understand a thing that's happening," Fezzik thought. "Could I be losing my strength? Could there be a mountain disease that takes your strength? There was a desert disease that took my parents' strength. That must be it. I must have caught a plague. But if that is it, why isn't he weak? No, I must still be strong. It has to be something else. Now what could it be?" Suddenly he knew. He had not fought against one man in so long. He had all but forgotten how. He had been fighting groups and gangs and bunches for so many years that the idea of having a single opponent was slow in making itself known to him, because you fought them entirely different. When there were 12 against you, you made certain moves, tried certain holds, acted in certain ways. When there was but one, you had to completely readjust yourself. Quickly now, Fezzik went back through time. How had he fought the champion of Sandiki? He flashed through that fight in his mind, then reminded himself of all the other victories against other champions, the men from Ispair and Small and Bolu and Zyle. He remembered fleeing Constantinople because he had beaten their champion so quickly, so easily. Yes, Fezzik thought, of course, and suddenly he readjusted his style to what it once had been. But by that time the man in black had him by the throat. The man in black was riding him, and his arms were locked across Fezzik's windpipe, one in front, one in behind. Fezzik reached back, but the man in black was hard to grasp. Fezzik could not get his arms around to his back and dislodge the enemy. Fezzik ran at a boulder, and at the last moment spun around so that the man in black received the main force of the charge. It was a terrible jolt. Fezzik knew it was, but the grip on his windpipe grew even tighter. Fezzik charged the boulder again, and again spun, and again he knew the power of the blow the man in black had taken, but still the grip remained. Fezzik clawed at the man in black's arms. He pounded his giant fists against them. By now, he had no air. Fezzik continued to struggle. He could feel a hollowness in his legs now. He could see the world beginning to pale, but he did not give up. He was the mighty Fezzik, lover of rhymes, and you did not give up, no matter what. Now the hollowness was in his arms, and the world was snowing. Fezzik went to his knees. He pounded still, but feebly. He fought still, but his blows would not have harmed a child. No air. There was no more air. There was no more anything, not for Fezzik, not in this world. I am beaten. I am going to die, he thought just before he fell into the mountain path. He was only half wrong. There's an instant between unconsciousness and death, and as the giant pitched onto the rocky path, that instant happened. And just before it happened, the man in black let go. He staggered to his feet and leaned against a boulder until he could walk. Fezzik lay sprawled, faintly breathing. The man in black looked around for a rope to secure the giant, gave up the search almost as soon as he'd begun. What good were ropes against strength like this? He would simply snap them. The man in black made his way back to where he dropped his sword. He put it back on. 2 down, and the hardest one to go. Vizzini was waiting for him. Indeed, he had set out a little picnic spread. From the knapsack that he always carried, he had taken a small handkerchief, and on it he had placed 2 wine goblets. In the center was a small leather wine holder, and beside it some cheese and apples. The spot could not have been lovelier, a high point on the mountain's path, with a splendid view all the way back to Florin Channel. Buttercup lay helpless beside the picnic, gagged and tied and blindfolded. Vizzini held his long knife against her white throat. "Welcome," Vizzini called when the man in black was almost upon them. The man in black stopped and surveyed the situation. "You've beaten my Turk," Vizzini said. "It would seem so. And now it is down to you, and it is down to me." "So that would seem too," the man in black said, edging just a half step closer to the hunchback's long knife. With a smile, the hunchback pushed the knife harder against Buttercup's throat. It was about to bring blood. "If you wish her dead, by all means keep moving," Vizzini said. The man in black froze. "Better," Vizzini nodded. No sound now beneath the moonlight. "I understand completely what you are trying to do," the Sicilian said finally, "and I want it quite clear that I resent your behavior. You are trying to kidnap what I have rightfully stolen, and I think it is quite ungentlemanly." "Let me explain," the man in black began, starting to edge forward. "You're killing her!" the Sicilian screamed, shoving harder with the knife. A drop of blood appeared now at Buttercup's throat, red against white. The man in black retreated. "Let me explain," he said again, but from a distance. Again the hunchback interrupted. "There is nothing you can tell me that I do not already know. I have not had the schooling equal to some, but for knowledge outside books, there is no one in the world so close to me. People say I read minds, but that is not, in all honesty, true. I merely predict the truth using logic and wisdom, and I say you are a kidnapper. Admit it. I will admit that, as a ransom item, she has value, nothing more. I have been instructed to do certain things with her. It is very important that I follow my instructions. If I do this properly, I'll be in demand for life. My instructions do not include ransom. They include death. So your explanations are meaningless. We cannot do business together. You wish to keep her alive for ransom, whereas it is terribly important to me that she stop breathing in the very near future. Has it occurred to you that I have gone to great effort and expense, as well as personal sacrifice, to reach this point?" the man in black replied. "And that if I fail now, I might get very angry. And if she stops breathing in the very near future, it is entirely possible that you will catch the same fatal illness? I have no doubt you could kill me. Any man who could get by Inigo and Fezzik would have no trouble disposing of me. However, has it occurred to you that if you did that, then neither of us would get what we want, you having lost your ransom item, me my life?" "We are at an impasse then," said the man in black. "I fear so," said the Sicilian. "I cannot compete with you physically. You are no match for my brains. You are that smart. There are no words to contain all my wisdom. I am so cunning, crafty, clever, so filled with deceit, guile, and chicanery, such a knave, so shrewd, cagey, as well as calculating, as diabolical as I am vulpine, as tricky as I am untrustworthy. Well, I told you there were not words invented yet to explain how great my brain is, but let me put it this way. The world is several million years old, and several billion people have at one time or another trod upon it, but I, Vizzini the Sicilian, am, speaking with pure candor and modesty, the slickest, sleekest, slyest, and wiliest fellow who has yet come down the pike." "In that case," said the man in black, "I challenge you to a battle of wits." Vizzini had to smile. "For the princess?" "You read my mind." "It just seems that way, I told you. It's merely logic and wisdom. To the death?" "Correct again." "I accept!" cried Vizzini. "Begin the battle!" "Pour the wine," said the man in black. Vizzini filled the 2 goblets with deep red liquid. The man in black pulled from his dark clothing a small packet and handed it to the hunchback. "Open it and inhale, but be careful not to touch." Vizzini took the packet and followed instructions. "I smell nothing." The man in black took the packet again. "What you do not smell is called iocane powder. It is odorless, tasteless, and dissolves immediately in any kind of liquid. It also happens to be the deadliest poison known to man." Vizzini was beginning to get excited. "I don't suppose you'd hand me the goblets," said the man in black. Vizzini shook his head. Take them yourself. My long knife does not leave her throat. The man in black reached down for the goblets. He took them and turned away. Vizzini cackled aloud in anticipation. The man in black busied himself a long moment. Then he turned again with a goblet in each hand. Very carefully, he put the goblet in his right hand in front of Vizzini and put the goblet in his left hand across the kerchief from the hunchback. He sat down in front of the left-handed goblet and dropped the empty iocane packet by the cheese. Your guess, he said. Where is the poison? Guess? Vizzini cried. I don't guess. I think. I ponder. I deduce. Then I decide. But I never guess. The battle of wits has begun, said the man in black. It ends when you decide and we drink the wine and find out who is right and who is dead. We both drink, need I add, and swallow naturally at precisely the same time. It's all so simple, said the hunchback. All I have to do is deduce from what I know of you the way your mind works. Are you the kind of man who would put the poison into his own glass or into the glass of his enemy? You're stalling, said the man in black. I'm relishing is what I'm doing, answered the Sicilian. No one has challenged my mind in years, and I love it. By the way, may I smell both goblets? Be my guest. Just be sure you put them down the same way you found them. The Sicilian sniffed his own glass, then he reached across the kerchief for the goblet of the man in black, and sniffed that. As you said, odorless. As I also said, you're stalling. The Sicilian smiled and stared at the wine goblets. Now a great fool, he began, would place the poison in his own goblet because he would know that only another great fool would reach first for what he was given. I'm clearly not a great fool, so I will clearly not reach for your wine. That's your final choice? No, because you knew I was not a great fool, so you would know that I would never fall for such a trick. You would count on it, so I clearly could not reach for mine either. Keep going, said the man in black. I intend to, the Sicilian reflected a moment. We have now decided the poison cup is most likely in front of you, but the poison is powder made from iocane, and iocane comes from Australia, and Australia, as everyone knows, is peopled with criminals, and criminals are used to having people not trust them, as I don't trust you, which means I can clearly not choose the wine in front of you. The man in black was starting to get nervous. But again, you must have suspected I knew the origins of iocane, so you would have known I knew about the criminals and criminal behavior, and therefore I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me. Truly, you have a dizzying intellect, whispered the man in black. You have beaten my Turk, which means you are exceptionally strong, and exceptionally strong men are convinced that they are too powerful ever to die, too powerful even for iocane poison, so you could have put it in your cup, trusting on your strength to save you. Thus I can clearly not choose the wine in front of you. The man in black was very nervous now. But you also bested my Spaniard, which means you must have studied, because he studied many years for his excellence. And if you can study, you are clearly more than simply strong. You are aware of how mortal we all are, and you do not wish to die, so you would have kept the poison as far from yourself as possible. Therefore, I can clearly not choose the wine in front of me. You're just trying to make me give something away with all this chatter, said the man in black angrily. Well, it won't work. You'll learn nothing from me, that I promise you. I have already learned everything from you, he said the Sicilian. I know where the poison is. Only a genius could have deduced as much. How fortunate for me that I happen to be one, said the hunchback, growing more and more amused now. You cannot frighten me, said the man in black, but there was fear all through his voice. Shall we drink then? Pick, choose, quit dragging it out. You don't know. You couldn't know. The Sicilian only smiled at the outburst. Then a strange look crossed his features, and he pointed off behind the man in black. What in the world could that be? He asked. The man in black turned around and looked. I don't see anything. Oh, well, I could have sworn I saw something. No matter. The Sicilian began to laugh. I don't understand. What's so funny, said the man in black. Tell you in a minute, said the hunchback. But first, let's drink. Then he picked up his own wine goblet. The man in black picked up the one in front of him. They drank. You guessed wrong, said the man in black. You only think I guessed wrong, said the Sicilian, his laughter ringing louder. That's what's so funny. I switched glasses when your back was turned. There was nothing for the man in black to say. Fool, cried the hunchback. You fell victim to one of the classic blunders. The most famous is never get involved in a land war in Asia, but only slightly less well known as this. Never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line. He was quite cheery until the iocane powder took effect. The man in black stepped quickly over the corpse, then roughly ripped the blindfold from the princess's eyes. I heard everything that happened, Buttercup began, and then she said, oh, because she had never been next to a dead man before. You killed him, she whispered finally. I let him die laughing, said the man in black. Pray I do as much for you. He lifted her, slashed her bonds away, put her on her feet, and started to pull her along. Please, Buttercup said, give me a moment to gather myself. The man in black released his grip. Buttercup rubbed her wrist, stopped, massaged her ankles. She took a final look at the Sicilian. To think, she murmured, all that time it was your cup that was poisoned. They were both poisoned, said the man in black. I've spent the past 2 years building up immunity to iocane powder. Buttercup looked up at him. He was terrifying to her, masked and hooded and dangerous. His voice was strained, rough. Who are you? She asked. I am no one to be trifled with, replied the man in black. That is all you ever need to know. And with that, he yanked her upright. You've had your moment. Again, he pulled her after him. And this time, she could do nothing but follow. They moved along the mountain path. The moonlight was very bright, and there were rocks everywhere. And to Buttercup, it all looked dead and yellow like the moon. She had just spent several hours with 3 men who were openly planning to kill her. So why, she wondered, was she more frightened now than then? Who was this horrid hooded figure to strike fear in her so? What could be worse than dying? I'll pay you a great deal of money to release me, she managed to say. The man in black glanced at her. You are rich, then? I will be, Buttercup said. Whatever you want for ransom, I'll promise. I'll get it for you if you'll let me go. The man in black just laughed. I was not speaking in jest. You promise? You? I shall release you on your promise? What is that worth, the vow of a woman? Oh, that is very funny, Highness, spoken in jest or not. They proceeded along the mountain path to an open space. The man in black stopped then. There were 1,000,000 stars fighting for prominence, and for a moment he seemed to be intent on nothing less than studying them all, as Buttercup watched his eyes flick from constellation to constellation behind his mask. Then, with no warning, he spun off the path, heading into the wild terrain, pulling her behind him. She stumbled. He pulled her to her feet again. Again she fell. Again he righted her. I cannot move this quickly. You can, and you will, or you will suffer greatly. Do you think I could make you suffer greatly? Buttercup nodded. Then run, cried the man in black, and he broke into a run himself, flying across rocks in the moonlight, pulling the princess behind him. She did her best to keep up. She was frightened as to what he would do to her, so she dared not fall again. After 5 minutes, the man in black stopped dead. Catch your breath, he commanded. Buttercup nodded, gasped in air, tried to quiet her heart. But then they were off again, with no warning, dashing across the mountainous terrain, heading... Where do you take me? Buttercup gasped when he again gave her a chance to rest. Surely even someone as arrogant as you cannot expect me to give an answer. It does not matter if you tell or not. He will find you. He, Highness? Prince Humperdinck. There is no greater hunter. He can track a falcon on a cloudy day. He can find you. You have confidence that your dearest love will save you, do you? I never said he was my dearest love, and yes, he will save me. That I know. Skip to page 183, second paragraph. It was close to dawn when they first saw the Armada. They were running along the edge of a towering ravine. They seemed almost to be at the top of the world. When they stopped, Buttercup sank down to rest. The man in black stood silently over her. Your love comes, not alone, he said then. Buttercup did not understand. The man in black pointed back the way they had come. Buttercup stared, and as she did, the waters of Florin Channel seemed as filled with light as the sky was filled with stars. He must have ordered every ship in Florin after you, the man in black said. Such a sight I have ever seen. He stared at all the lanterns on the ships as they moved. You can never escape him, Buttercup said. If you release me, I promise that you will come to no harm. You are much too generous. I could never accept such an offer. I offered you your life. That was generous enough. Highness, said the man in black, and his hands were suddenly at her throat. If there is talks of life to be done, let me do it. You would not kill me. You did not steal me from murderers to murder me yourself. Wise as well as loving, said the man in black. He jerked her to her feet, and they ran along the edge of the great ravine. It was hundreds of feet deep and filled with rocks and trees and lifting shadows. Abruptly, the man in black stopped, stared back at the Armada. To be honest, he said, I had not expected quite so many. You can never predict my prince. That is why he is the greatest hunter. I wonder, said the man in black, will he stay in one group or will he divide? Some to search the coastline, some to follow your path on land. What do you think? I only know he will find me, and if you have not given me my freedom first, he will not treat you gently. Surely he must have discussed things with you, the thrill of the hunt. What has he done in the past with many ships? We do not discuss hunting, that I can assure you. Not hunting, not love. What do you talk about? We do not see all that much of each other. Tender couple. Buttercup could feel the upset coming. We are always very honest with each other. Not everyone can say as much. May I please tell you something, Highness? You're very cold. I'm not. Very cold and very young. And if you live, I think you'll turn to hoarfrost. Why do you pick at me? I've come to terms with my life, and that is my affair. I'm not cold, I swear, but I have decided certain things. It is best for me to ignore emotion. I have not been happy dealing with it. Her heart was a secret garden, and the walls were very high. I loved once, Buttercup said after a moment. It worked out badly. Another rich man, yes, and he left you for a richer woman? No, poor. Poor, and it killed him. Were you sorry? Did you feel pain? Admit that you felt nothing. Do not mock my grief. I died that day. The Armada began to fire signal cannons. The explosions echoed through the mountains. The man in black stared as the ships began to change formation. And while he was watching the ships, Buttercup shoved him with all her strength remaining. For a moment, the man in black teetered at the ravine edge. His arms spun like windmills, fighting for balance. They swung and gripped the air, and then he began his slide. Down went the man in black, stumbling and torn and reaching out to stop his descent, but the ravine was too steep, and nothing could be done. Down, down, rolling over rocks, spinning, out of control. Buttercup stared at what she had done. Finally, he rested far below her, silent and without motion. "You can die too, for all I care," she said, and then she turned away. Words followed her, whispered from far, weak and warm and familiar. "As you wish." Dawn in the mountains. Buttercup turned back to the source of the sound and stared down as, in first light, the man in black struggled to remove his mask. "Oh, my dear Wesley," Buttercup said, "what have I done to you now?" From the bottom of the ravine, there came only silence. Buttercup hesitated not a moment. Down she went after him, keeping her feet as best she could, and as she began, she thought she heard him crying out to her over and over, but she could not make sense of his words, because inside her now there was the thunder of walls crumbling, and that was noise enough. Besides, her balance quickly was gone, and the ravine had her. She fell fast and she fell hard, but what did that matter, since she would have gladly dropped 1,000 feet onto a bed of nails if Wesley had been waiting at the bottom? Down, down, tossed and spinning, crashing, torn, out of all control, she rolled and twisted and plunged, cartwheeling toward what was left of her beloved. From his position at the point of the Armada, Prince Humperdinck stared up at the cliffs of Insanity. This was just like any other hunt. He made himself think away the quarry. It did not matter if you were after an antelope or a bride-to-be. The procedures held. You gathered evidence, then you acted. You studied, then you performed. If you studied too little, the chances were strong that your actions would also be too late. You had to take time. And so, frozen in thought, he continued to stare up the sheer face of the cliffs. Obviously, someone had recently climbed them. There were foot scratchings all the way up a straight line, which meant most certainly a rope, an arm-over-arm climb up a 1,000-foot rope with occasional foot kicks for balance. To make such a climb required both strength and planning, so the prince made those marks in his brain. My enemy is strong. My enemy is not impulsive. Now his eyes reached a point, perhaps 300 feet from the top. Here it began to get interesting. Now the foot scratchings were deeper, more frequent, and they followed no direct ascending line. Either someone left the rope 300 feet from the top intentionally, which made no sense, or the rope was cut while that someone was still 300 feet from safety. For clearly this last part of the climb was made up the rock face itself. But who had such talent? And why had he been called to exercise it at such a deadly time, 700 feet above disaster? "I must examine the tops of the cliffs of Insanity," the prince said, without bothering to turn. From behind him, Count Rugen only said "done" and awaited further instructions. "Send half the Armada south along the coastline, the other north. They should meet by twilight near the fire swamp. Our ship will sail to the first landing possibility, and you will follow me with your soldiers. Ready the whites." Count Rugen signaled the cannoneer, and the prince's instructions boomed along the cliffs. Within minutes, the Armada had begun to split, with only the prince's giant ship sailing alone closest to the coastline, looking for a landing possibility. There, the prince ordered, some time later, his ship began maneuvering into the cove for a safe place to anchor. That took time, but not much, because the captain was skilled, and more than that, the prince was quick to lose patience, and no one dared risk that. Humperdinck jumped from ship to shore, a plank was lowered, and the whites were led to the ground. Of all his accomplishments, none pleased the prince as did these horses. Some day he would have an army of them, but getting the bloodlines perfect was a slow business. He now had 4 whites, and they were identical, snowy, tireless giants, 20 hands high. On flat land, nothing could catch them. Even on hills and rocky terrain, there was nothing short of Araby close to their equal. The prince, when rushed, rode all 4 bareback, the only way he ever rode, riding 1, leading 3, changing beasts in mid-stride so that no single animal had to bear his bulk to the tiring point. Now he mounted and was gone. It took him considerably less than an hour to reach the edge of the cliffs of Insanity. He dismounted, went to his knees, commenced his study of the terrain. There had been a rope tied around a giant oak. The bark at the base was broken and scraped, so probably whoever had first reached the top untied the rope, and whoever was on the rope at that moment was 300 feet from the peak and somehow survived the climb. A great jumble of footprints caused him trouble. It was hard to ascertain what had gone on. Perhaps a conference, because 2 sets of footprints seemed to lead off while 1 remained pacing the cliff edge. Then there were 2 on the cliff edge. Humperdinck examined the prince until he was certain of 2 things. 1, a fencing match had taken place, and 2, the combatants were both masters. The stride length, the quickness of the foot feints, all clearly revealed to his unfailing eye, made him reassess his second conclusion. They were at least masters, probably better. That he closed his eyes and concentrated on smelling out the blood. Surely in a match of such ferocity, blood must have been spilled. Now it was a matter of giving his entire body over to his sense of smell. The prince had worked at this for many years, ever since a wounded tigress had surprised him from a tree limb while he was tracking her. He had let his eyes follow the blood hunt, and it almost killed him. Now he trusted only his olfactories. If there was blood within 100 yards, he would find it. He opened his eyes, moved without hesitation toward a group of large boulders until he found the blood drops. There were few of them, and they were dry, but less than 3 hours old. Humperdinck smiled. When you had the whites under you, 3 hours was a finger snap. He retraced the duel then, for it confused him. It seemed to range from cliff edge and back, then return to the cliff edge, and sometimes the left foot seemed to be leading, sometimes the right, which made no logical sense at all. Clearly swordsmen were changing hands, but why would a master do that unless his good arm was wounded to the point of uselessness, and that clearly had not happened because a wound of that depth would have left blood spores, and there was simply not enough blood in the area to indicate that. Strange, strange, Humperdinck continued his wanderings. Stranger still, the battle could not have ended in death. He knelt by the outline of a body. Clearly a man had lain unconscious here, but again no blood. There was a mighty duel, Prince Humperdinck said, directing his comment toward Count Rugen, who had finally caught up, together with a contingent of 100 mounted men at arms. My guess would be, and for a moment the prince paused, following footsteps, would be that whoever fell here ran off there, and he pointed one way, and that whoever was the victor ran off along the mountain path in almost precisely the opposite direction. It is also my opinion that the victor was following the path taken by the princess. Shall we follow them both? The count asked. I think not, Prince Humperdinck replied. Whoever is gone is of minimal importance, since whoever has the princess is whoever we're after. And because we don't know the nature of the trap we might be being led into, we need all the arms we have in one band. Clearly, this has been planned by countrymen of Gilder, and nothing must ever be put past them. You think this is a trap, then? The count asked. I always think everything is a trap unless proven otherwise, the prince answered, which is why I'm still alive. And with that, he was back aboard a white and galloping. When he reached the mountain path where the hand fight happened, the prince did not even bother dismounting. Everything that could be seen was quite visible from horseback. Someone has beaten a giant, he said, when the count was close enough. The giant has run away. Do you see? The count, of course, saw nothing but rock and mountain path. I would not think to doubt you. And look there, cried the prince, because now he saw for the first time in the rubble of the mountain path the footsteps of a woman. The princess is alive! And again the whites were thundering across the mountain. When the count caught up with him again, the prince was kneeling over the still body of a hunchback. The count dismounted. Smell this, the prince said, and he handed up a goblet. Nothing, the count said. No odor at all. Iocane, the prince replied. I would bet my life on it. I know of nothing else that kills so silently. He stood up then. The princess was still alive. Her footprints follow the path. He shouted to the 100 mounted men. There will be great suffering in Gilder if she dies. On foot now, he ran along the mountain path, following the footsteps that he alone could see. And when those footsteps left the path for wilder terrain, he followed still. Strung out behind him, the count and all the soldiers did their best to keep up. Men stumbled, horses fell, even the count tripped from time to time. Prince Humperdinck never even broke stride. He ran steadily, mechanically, his barrel legs pumping like a metronome. It was 2 hours after dawn when he reached the steep ravine. Odd, he said to the count, who was tiring badly. The count continued only to breathe deeply. 2 bodies fell to the bottom, and they did not come back up. That is odd, the count managed. No, that isn't what's odd, the prince corrected. Clearly the kidnapper did not come back up because the climb was too steep, and our cannons must have let him know that they were closely pursued. His decision, which I applaud, was to make better time running along the ravine floor. The count waited for the prince to continue. It's just odd that a man who is a master fencer, a defeater of giants, and expert in the use of iocane powder would not know what this ravine opens into. And what is that? Asked the count. The fire swamp, said Prince Humperdinck. Then we have him, said the count. Precisely so. It was a well-documented trait of his to smile only just before the kill. The smile was very much in evidence now. Wesley indeed had not the least idea that he was racing dead into the fire swamp. He knew only, once Buttercup was down at the ravine bottom beside him, that to climb out would take, as Prince Humperdinck had assumed, too much time. Wesley noted only the ravine bottom was flat rock and heading into the general direction he wanted to follow, so he and Buttercup fled along, both of them very much aware that gigantic forces were following them, and undoubtedly cutting into their lead. The ravine grew increasingly sheer as they went along, and Wesley soon realized that whereas once he probably could have helped her through the climb, now there was simply no way of doing so. He had made his choice, and there was no changing possible. Wherever the ravine led was their destination, and that, quite simply, was that. skip this. This is about their reunion. He says that he can't write about it. Go to page 196, down to where it says Wesley. Wesley, Buttercup said then, just before I started down after you, while I was still up there, I could hear you saying something, but the words were indistinct. I've forgotten whatever it was. Terrible liar. He smiled at her and kissed her cheek. It's not important, believe me. The past has a way of being past. We must not begin with secrets from each other. She meant it. He could tell that. Trust me, he tried. I do, so tell me your words, or I shall be given reason not to. Wesley sighed. What I was trying to get through to you, beloved sweet, what I was, as a matter of accurate fact, shouting with everything I had left was, whatever you do, stay up there. Don't come down here, please. You didn't want to see me. Of course I wanted to see you. I just didn't want to see you down here. Why ever not? Because now, my precious, we're more or less kind of trapped. I can't climb out of here and bring you with me without it taking all day. I can't get out myself, most likely, without it taking all day. But with the addition of your lovely bulk, it's not about to happen. Nonsense. You climb the cliffs of insanity, and this isn't nearly as steep. And it took a little out of me, too, let me tell you. And after that little effort, I tangled with a fellow who knew a little something about fencing. And after that, I spent a few happy moments grappling with a giant. And after that, I had to outfake a Sicilian to death, when any mistake meant it was a knife in the throat for you. And after that, I've run my lungs out a couple of hours. And after that, I was pushed 200 feet down a rock ravine. I'm tired, Buttercup. Do you understand tired? I've put in a night, is what I'm trying to get through to you. I'm not stupid, you know. Quit bragging. Stop being rude. When was the last time you read a book? The truth now. And picture books don't count. I mean something with print in it. Buttercup walked away from him. There's other things to read than print, she said. And the Princess of Hammersmith is displeased with you and is thinking seriously of going home. With no more words, she whirled into his arms then, saying, Oh, Wesley, I didn't mean that. I didn't. Not a single syllable of it. Now, Wesley knew that she meant to say not a single syllable of it, because a syllabub was something you ate with cream and wine mixed in together to form the base. But he also knew an apology when he heard one. So he held her very close and shut his loving eyes and only whispered, I knew it was false, believe me, every single syllable. And that, out of the way, they started running as fast as they could along the flat rock floor of the ravine. Wesley, naturally enough, was considerably ahead of Buttercup with the realization that they were heading into the fire swamp. Whether it was a touch of sulfur riding a breeze or a flick of yellow flame far ahead in the daylight, he could not say for sure. But once he realized what was about to happen, he began as casually as possible to find a way to avoid it. A quick glance up the sheer ravine sides ruled out any possibility of his getting Buttercup past the climb. He dropped to the ground, as he had been doing every few minutes to test the speed of their trackers. Now he guessed them to be less than half an hour behind and gaining. He rose and ran with her, faster, neither of them spending breath in conversation. It was only a matter of time before she understood what they were about to be into, so he decided to beat back her panic in any way possible. I think we can slow down a bit now, he told her, slowing down a bit. They're still well behind. Buttercup took a deep breath of relief. Wesley made a show of checking their surroundings, then he gave her his best smile. With any luck at all, he said, we should soon be safely in the fire swamp. Buttercup heard his speech, of course, but she did not take it well. A few words now on two related subjects. One, fire swamps in general, and two, the Florin Gilder fire swamp in particular. One, fire swamps are, of course, entirely misnamed. As to why this happened, no one knows, though probably the colorful quality of the two words together is enough. Simply, there are swamps which contain a large percentage of sulfur and other gas bubbles that burst continually into flame. They are covered with lush, giant trees that shadow the ground, making the flame burst seem particularly dramatic. Because they are dark, they are almost always quite moist, thereby attracting the standard insect and alligator community that prefers a moist climate. In other words, a fire swamp is just a swamp, period. The rest is embroidery. 2. The Florin Gilder fire swamp did and does have some particular odd characteristics. A, the existence of snow sand, and B, the presence of the ROUS, about which a bit more later. Snow sand is usually, again incorrectly, identified with lightning sand. Nothing could be less accurate. Lightning sand is moist and basically destroys by drowning. Snow sand is as powdery as anything short of talcum and destroys by suffocation. Most particularly, though, the Florin Gilder fire swamp was used to frighten children. There was not a child in either country that at one time or another was not, when misbehaving very badly, threatened with abandonment in the fire swamp. Do that one more time and you're going to the fire swamp is as common as clean your plate, people are starving in China. And so as children grew, so did the danger of the fire swamp in their enlarging imaginations. No one, of course, ever actually went into the fire swamp, although every year or so a diseased ROUS might wander out to die, and its discovery would only add to the myth and the horror. The largest known fire swamp is, of course, within a day's drive of Perth. It is impenetrable and over 25 miles square. The one between Florin and Gilder was barely a third that size. No one had been able to discover if it was impenetrable or not. Buttercup stared at the fire swamp. As a child, she had once spent an entire nightmare year convinced that she was going to die there. Now she could not move another step. The giant trees blackened the ground ahead of her. From every part came the sudden flames. "You cannot ask it of me," she said. "I must. I once dreamed I would die here. So did I. So did we all. Were you 8 that year?" "I was." 8, 6, I can't remember." Wesley took her hand. She could not move. "Must we?" Wesley nodded. "Why?" "Now is not the time." He pulled her gently. She still could not move. Wesley took her in her arms. "Child, sweet child, I have a knife, I have my sword. I did not come across the world to lose you now." Buttercup was searching somewhere for a sufficiency of courage. Evidently, she found it in his eyes. At any rate, hand in hand, they moved into the shadows of the fire swamp. Prince Humperdinck just stared. He sat astride a white, studying the footsteps down on the floor of the ravine. There was simply no other conclusion. The kidnapper had dragged his princess into it. Count Rugen sat alongside. "Did they actually go in?" The prince nodded. Praying the answer would be no, the count asked, "Do you think we should follow them?" The prince shook his head. "They'll either live or die in there. If they die, I have no wish to join them. If they live, I'll greet them on the other side." "It's too far round," the count said. "Not for my whites." "We'll follow as best we can," the count said. He stared again at the fire swamp. He must be very desperate, or very frightened, or very stupid, or very brave. "Very all four, I should think," the prince replied. Wesley led the way. Buttercup stayed just behind. And they made, from the outset, very good time. The dreams for the fire swamp... The main thing she realized was to forget your childhood dreams, for the fire swamp was bad, but it wasn't that bad. The odor of the escaping gases, which at first seemed almost totally punishing, soon diminished through familiarity. The sudden bursts of flame were easily avoided because just before they struck, there was a deep kind of popping sound, clearly coming from the vicinity where the flames would then appear. Wesley carried his sword in his right hand, his long knife in his left, waiting for the first ROUS, but none appeared. He had cut a very long piece of strong vine and coiled it over one shoulder, and was busy working on it as they moved. "What we'll do once I've got this properly done is," he told her, moving steadily on beneath the giant trees, "we'll attach ourselves to each other so that way, no matter what the darkness, we'll be close. Actually, I think there's more precaution than necessary, because to tell you the truth, I'm almost disappointed. This place is bad, all right, but it's not that bad, don't you agree?" Buttercup wanted to, totally, and she would have, too, only by then the snow sand had her. Wesley turned only in time to see her disappear. Buttercup had simply let her attention wander for a moment. The ground seemed solid enough, and she had no idea what snow sand looked like anyway. But once her front foot began to sink in, she could not pull back, and even before she could scream, she was gone. It was like falling through a cloud. The sand was the finest in the world, and there was no bulk to it whatsoever, and at first no unpleasantness. She was just falling gently through this soft, powdery mass, falling farther and farther from anything resembling life. But she could not allow herself to panic. Wesley had instructed her on how to behave if this happened, and she followed his word now. She spread her arms and spread her fingers and forced herself into the position resembling that of a dead man's float, swimming. All this because Wesley had told her to, because the more she could spread herself, the slower she would sink, and the slower she sank, the quicker he could dive down after her and catch her. Buttercup's ears were now caked with snow sand all the way in, and her nose was filled with snow sand, both nostrils, and she knew if she opened her eyes, a million tiny, fine bits of snow sand would seep behind her eyelids, and now she was beginning to panic badly. How long had she been falling? Hours, it seemed, and she was having pain in holding her breath. "You must hold it till I find you," he had said. "You must go into a dead man's float, and you must close your eyes and hold your breath, and I'll come get you, and we'll both have a wonderful story for our grandchildren." Buttercup continued to sink. The weight of the sand began to brutalize her shoulders. The small of her back began to ache. It was agony keeping her arms outstretched and her fingers spread when it was all so useless. The snow sand was heavier and heavier on her now as she sank always down. And was it bottomless, as they thought when they were children? Did you just sink forever until the sand ate away at you, and then did your poor bones continue the trip forever down? No, surely there had to be somewhere, be a resting place. A resting place, Buttercup thought. What a wonderful thing. I'm so tired, and I want to rest in... "Wesley, come save me," she screamed, or started to. Because in order to scream, you had to open your mouth, so all she really got out was the first sound of the word, "wah." After that, the snow sand was down into her throat, and she was done. Wesley had made a terrific start. Before she had even entirely disappeared, he had dropped his sword and long knife and had gotten a vine coil from his shoulder. It took him next to no time to knot one end around a giant tree, and holding tight to the free end, he simply dove headlong into the snow sand, kicking his feet as he sank for greater speed. There was no question in his mind of failure. He knew he would find her, and he knew she would be upset and hysterical and possibly even brain-tumbled, but alive. And that was, in the end, the only fact of lasting import. The snow sand had his ears and nose blocked, and he hoped she had not panicked and had remembered to spread eagle her body so that he could catch her quickly with his headlong dive. If she remembered, it wouldn't be that hard, the same really as rescuing a drowning swimmer in murky water. They floated slowly down. You dove straight down. You kicked. You pulled with your free arm. You gained on them. You grabbed them. You brought them to the surface, and the only real problem then would be convincing your grandchildren that such a thing had actually happened and was not just another family fable. He was still concerning his mind with the infants yet unborn when something happened he had not counted on. The vine was not long enough. He hung suspended for a moment, holding to the end of it as it stretched straight up through the snow sand to the security of the giant tree. To release the vine was truly madness. There was no possibility of forcing your body all the way back up to the surface. A few feet of ascension was possible if you kicked wildly, but no more. So if he let go of the vine and did not find her within a finger snap, it was all up for both of them. Wesley let go of the vine without a qualm, because he had come too far to fail now. Failure was not even a problem to be considered. Down he sank then, and within a finger snap he had his hand around her wrist. Wesley screamed then himself, in horror and surprise, and the snow sand gouged at his throat, for what he had grabbed was a skeleton wrist, bone only, no flesh left at all. That happened in snow sand. Once the skeleton was picked clean, it would begin often to float like seaweed in a quiet tide, shifting this way and that, sometimes surfacing more often than just journeying through the snow sand for eternity. Wesley threw the wrist away and reached out blindly with both hands, now scrabbling wildly to touch some part of her, because failure was not a problem. Failure is not a problem, he told himself. It is not a problem to be considered, so forget failure. Just keep busy and find her. And he found her. Her foot, more precisely, and pulled it to him, and then his arm was around her perfect waist, and he began to kick with any strength left, needing now to rise a few yards to the end of the vine. The idea that it might be difficult finding a single vine strand in a small sea of snow sand never bothered him. Failure was not a problem. He would simply have to kick, and when he had kicked hard enough, he would rise, and when he had risen enough, he would reach out for the vine, and when he reached out, it would be there, and when it was there, he would tie her to it, and with his last breath, he would pull them both up to life, which is exactly what happened. She remained unconscious for a very long time. Wesley busied himself as best he could, cleansing the snow sand from ears and nose and mouth, and most delicate of all, from beneath the lids of her eyes. The length of her quietness disturbed him vaguely. It was almost as if she knew she had died and was afraid to find out for a fact that it was true. He held her in his arms, rocked her slowly. Eventually she was blinking. For a time she looked around and around. "We lived then," she managed finally. "We're a hardy breed." "What a wonderful surprise!" "No need," he was going to say. No need for worry, but her panic struck too quickly. It was normal enough reaction, and he did not try to block it. Rather, held her firmly and let the hysteria run its course. She shuddered for a time as if she fully intended to fly apart, but that was the worst. From there it was but a few minutes to quiet sobbing. Then she was Buttercup again. Wesley stood, buckled on his sword, and replaced his long knife. "Come," he said. "We have far to go." "Not until you tell me," she replied. "Why must we endure this?" "Now is not the time." Wesley held out his hand. "It is the time." She stayed where she was, on the ground. Wesley sighed. She meant it. "All right," he said finally. "I'll explain, but we must keep moving." Buttercup waited. "We must get through the fire swamp," Wesley began, "for one good and simple reason." Once he had started talking, Buttercup stood, following close behind him as he went on. "I had always intended getting to the far side. I had not, I must admit, expected to go through. Around was my intention, but the ravine forced me to change." "The good and simple reason," Buttercup prompted. "On the far end of the fire swamp is the mouth of Giant Eel Bay, and anchored far out in the deepest waters of that bay is the great ship Revenge. The Revenge is the sole property of the dread pirate Roberts." "The man who killed you," Buttercup said. "That man? The one who broke my heart? The dread pirate Roberts took your life. That was the story I was told." "Quite correct," Wesley said. "And that ship is our destination." "You know the dread pirate Roberts? You are friendly with such a man?" "It's a little more than that," Wesley said. "I don't expect you to quite grasp this all at once. Just believe it's true. You see, I am the dread pirate Roberts." "I fail to see how that is possible, since he has been marauding for 20 years, and you only left me 3 years ago." "I myself am often surprised at life's little quirks," Wesley admitted. "Did he in fact capture you when you were sailing for the Carolinas?" "He did. His ship Revenge captured the ship I was on, the Queen's Pride, and we were all to be put to death. But Roberts did not kill you." "Clearly." Why? I cannot say for sure, but I think it's because I asked him please not to. The please, I suspect, aroused his interest. I didn't beg or offer bribery as the others were doing. At any rate, we held off with his sword long enough to ask, "Why should I make an exception of you?" And I explained my mission, how I had to get to America to get money to reunite me with the most beautiful woman ever reared by man, namely you. "I doubt that she is as beautiful as you imagine," he said, and he raised his sword again. "Hair the color of autumn," I said, "and skin like wintry cream." "Wintry cream, hey?" he said. He was interested now, at least a bit, so I went on describing the rest of you, and at the end I knew I had him convinced of the truth of my affection for you. "I'll tell you, Wesley," he said then, "I feel genuinely sorry about this, but if I make an exception in your case, news will get out that the dread Pirate Roberts has gone soft, and that will make the beginning of my downfall, for once they stop fearing you, piracy becomes nothing but work, work, work all the time, and I am far too old for such a life. I swear I will never tell, not even my beloved," I said, "and if you will let me live, I will be your personal valet and slave for 5 full years. And if I ever once complain or cause you anger, you may chop my head off then and there, and I will die with praise for your fairness on my lips." I knew I had him thinking. "Go below," he said. "I'll most likely kill you tomorrow." Wesley stopped talking for a moment and pretended to clear his throat because he had spotted the first ROUS following behind them. There seemed no need yet to alert her, so he just continued to clear his throat and hurry along between the flame bursts. "What happened tomorrow?" Buttercup urged. "Go on." "Well, you know what an industrious fellow I am. You remember how I liked to learn and how I had already trained myself to work 20 hours a day. I decided to learn what I could about piracy in the time left allotted me, since it would at least keep my mind off my coming slaughter. So I helped the cook and I cleaned the hold and in general did whatever was asked of me, hoping that my energies might be favorably noted by the dread Pirate Roberts himself. "Well, I've come to kill you," he said the next morning, and I said, "Thank you for the extra time. It's been most fascinating. I've learned such a great deal." And he said, "Overnight? What could you learn in that time?" And I said that no one had ever explained to your cook the difference between the table salt and the cayenne pepper. "Things have been a bit fiery this trip," he admitted. "Go on, what else?" And I explained that there would have been more room in the hold if boxes had been stacked differently. And then he noticed that I had completely reorganized things down there, and fortunately for me, there was more room. And finally he said, "Very well, you can be my valet for a day. I've never had a valet before. Probably I won't like it, so I'll kill you in the morning." Every night for the next year, he always said something like that to me. "Thank you for everything, Wesley. Good night now. I'll probably kill you in the morning." By the end of that year, of course, we were more than valet and master. He was a pudgy little man, not at all fierce as you would expect the dread Pirate Roberts to be, and I like to think he was as fond of me as I of him. By then I had learned really quite a great deal about sailing and hand fighting and fencing and throwing the long knife, and had never been in as excellent physical condition. At the end of one year, my captain said to me, "Enough of this valet business, Wesley. From now on you are my second in command." And I said, "Thank you, sir, but I could never be a pirate." And he said, "You want to get back to that autumn-haired creature of yours, don't you?" And I didn't even have to bother answering that. "A good year or two of piracy and you'll be rich and back you go." And I said, "Your men have been with you for years and they aren't rich." And he said, "That's because they are not the captain. I am going to retire soon, Wesley, and the revenge will be yours." I must admit, beloved, I weakened a bit there. But we reached no final decision. Instead, he agreed to let me assist him in the next few captures and see how I liked it, which I did. There was now another ROUS following them, flanking them as they moved. Buttercup saw them now. "Wesley, shh, it's all right. I'm watching them. Shall I finish? Will it take your mind off of them?" "You helped him with the next few captures," Buttercup said, "to see if you liked it." Wesley dodged a sudden burst of flame, shielded Buttercup from the heat. Not only did I like it, but it turned out I was talented as well, so talented that the Roberts said to me one April morning, "Wesley, the next ship is yours. Let's see how you do." That afternoon we spotted a fat Spanish beauty loaded for Madrid. I sailed up close. They were in a panic. "Who is it?" their captain cried. "Wesley," I told them. "Never heard of you," he answered, and with that they opened fire. Disaster. They had no fear of me at all. I was so flustered I did everything wrong, and soon they got away. I was, do I have to add, disheartened. Roberts called me to his cabin. I slunk in like a whipped boy. "Buck up," he told me, and then he closed the door and we were quite alone. "What I'm about to tell you I have never said before, and you must guard it closely." I, of course, said I would. "I am not the dread Pirate Roberts," he said. "My name is Ryan. I inherited this ship from the previous dread Pirate Roberts, just as you will inherit it from me. The man I inherited it from was not the real dread Pirate Roberts either. His name was Cumberbund. The real, original dread Pirate Roberts has been retired 15 years and has been living like a king in Patagonia." I confessed to my confusion. "It's really very simple," Ryan explained. "After several years, the original Roberts was so rich he wanted to retire. Clooney was his friend and first mate, so he gave the ship to Clooney, who had an identical experience to yours. The first ship he attempted to board nearly blew him out of the water. So Roberts, realizing the name was the thing that inspired the necessary fear, sailed the Revenge to port, changed crews entirely, and Clooney told everyone he was the Dread Pirate Roberts, and who was to know he was not? When Clooney retired rich, he passed the name to Cummerbund, Cummerbund to me, and I, Felix Raymond Ryan of Bootle outside Liverpool, now dubbed thee, Wesley, the Dread Pirate Roberts. All we need to do is land, take on some new young pirates. I will sail along for a few days as Ryan, your first mate. Will tell everyone about my years with you, the Dread Pirate Roberts. Then you will let me off when they are all believers, and the waters of the world are yours. Wesley smiled at Buttercup. So now you know, and you should also realize why it is so foolish to be afraid. But I am afraid. We'll all be happy in the end. Consider, a little over 3 years ago, you were a milkmaid and I was a farm boy. Now you're almost a queen and I rule uncontested on the water. Surely such individuals were never intended to die in a fire swamp. How can you be sure? Well, because we're together, hand in hand, in love. Oh yes, Buttercup said. I keep forgetting that. Both her words and her tone were a trifle standoffish, something Wesley surely would have noticed had not a ROUS attacked him from the tree branch, sinking its giant teeth into his unprotected shoulder, forcing him to earth in a very unexpected spurt of blood. The other two that had been following launched their attack then too, ignoring Buttercup, driving forward with all their hungry strength to Wesley's bleeding shoulder. Any discussion of the ROUS, rodents of unusual size, must begin with the South American capybara, which has been known to reach a weight of 150 pounds. They are nothing but water hogs, however, and present very little danger. The largest pure rat is probably the Tasmanian, which has actually been weighed at 100 pounds. But they have little agility, tending to sloth when they reach full growth, and most Tasmanian herdsmen have learned with ease to avoid them. The Fire Swamp ROUS were a pure rat strain, weighed usually 80 pounds, and had the speed of wolfhounds. They were also carnivorous and capable of frenzy. The rats struggled with each other to reach Wesley's wound. Their enormous front teeth tore at the unprotected flesh of his left shoulder, and he had no idea if Buttercup was already half devoured. He only knew that if he didn't do something desperate right there and then, she soon would be. So he intentionally rolled his body into a spurt of a flame. His clothes began to burn, that he expected, but more importantly, the rats shied away from the heat and the flames for just an instant. But that was enough for him to reach and throw his long knife into the heart of the nearest beast. The other two turned instantly on their own kind and began eating it while it was still screaming. Wesley had his sword by then, and with 2 quick thrusts, the trio of rats was disposed of. "Hurry!" he shouted to Buttercup, who stood frozen where she had been when the first rat landed. "Bandages! Bandages!" Wesley cried. "Make me some bandages, or we die!" And with that, he rolled onto the ground, tore off his burning clothes, and set to work caking mud onto the deep wound in his shoulder. "They're like sharks, blood creatures. It's blood they thrive on." He smeared more and more mud into his wound. "We must stop my bleeding, and we must cover the wound so they do not smell it. If they don't smell the blood, we'll survive. If they do, we're for it. So help me, please." Buttercup ripped her clothes into patches and ties and worked at the wound, caking the blood with mud from the floor of the fire swamp, then bandaging and rebandaging over it. "We'll know soon enough," Wesley said, because 2 more rats were watching them. Wesley stood, sword in hand. "If they charge, they smell it," he whispered. The giant rats stood watching. "Come," Wesley whispered. The 2 more giant rats joined the first pair. Without warning, Wesley's sword flashed, and the nearest rat was bleeding. The other 3 contented themselves with that for a while. Wesley took Buttercup's hand, and again they started to move. "How bad are you?" she said. "I'm in something close to agony, but we can talk about that later. Hurry now." They hurried. They had been in the fire swamp for 1 hour, and it turned out to be the easiest one they had of the 6 it took to cross it. But they crossed it, alive and together, hand and very much in hand. It was nearly dusk when they at last saw the great ship Revenge, far out in the deepest part of the bay. Wesley, still within the confines of the fire swamp, sank, beaten to his knees. For between him and his ship were more than a few inconveniences. From the north sailed in half the great armada, from the south now the other half. 100 mounted horsemen, armored and armed. In front of them the Count, and out alone in front of all, the 4 whites, with the prince astride the leader. Wesley stood. "We took too long in crossing. The fault is mine." "I accept your surrender," the prince said. Wesley held Buttercup's hand. "No one is surrendering," he said. "You're acting silly now," the prince replied. "I credit you with bravery. Don't make yourself a fool." What is so foolish about winning?" Wesley wanted to know. "It's my opinion that in order to capture us, you will have to come into the fire swamp. We have spent many hours here now. We know where the snow sand waits. I doubt that you or your men will be any too anxious to follow us in here, and by morning we will have slipped away." I doubt that somehow, said the prince, and he gestured out to sea. Half the armada had begun to give chase to the great ship Revenge, and the Revenge alone was sailing, as it had to do, away. Surrender, the prince said. It will not happen. Surrender, the prince shouted. Death first, Wesley roared. Will you promise not to hurt him? Buttercup whispered. What was that? The prince said. What was that? Wesley said. Buttercup took a step forward and said, if we surrender freely and without struggle, if life returns to what it once was one dusk ago, will you swear not to hurt this man? Prince Humperdinck raised his right hand. I swear on the grave of my soon-to-be dead father and the soul of my already dead mother that I shall not hurt this man, and if I do, may I never hunt again, though I live 1,000 years. Buttercup turned to Wesley. There, she said, you can't ask for more than that, and that is the truth. The truth, said Wesley, is that you would rather live with your prince than die with your love. I would rather live than die, I admit it. We were talking of love, madam. There was a long pause, then Buttercup said it. I can live without love. And with that, she left Wesley alone. Prince Humperdinck watched her as she began the long cross to him. When we are out of sight, he said to Count Rugen, take that man in black and put him in the 5th level of the zoo of death. The Count nodded. For a moment I believed you when you swore. I spoke truth. I never lie, said the prince replied. I said I would not hurt him, but I never for a moment said that he would not suffer pain. You will do the actual tormenting. I will only spectate. He opened his arms then for his princess. He belongs to the ship Revenge, Buttercup said. He is, she began about to tell Wesley's story, but that was not for her to repeat. A simple sailor, and I have known him since I was a child. Will you arrange that? Must I swear again? No need, Buttercup said, because she knew, as did everyone, that the prince was far more forthright than any Florinese. Come along, my princess. He took her hand. Buttercup went away with him. Wesley watched it all. He stood silently at the edge of the fire swamp. It was darker now, but the flame spurts behind him outlined his face. He was glazed with fatigue. He had been bitten, cut, gone without rest, had assaulted the cliffs of insanity, had saved and taken lives. He had risked this world, his world, and now it was walking away from him, hand in hand with a ruffian prince. Then Buttercup was gone, out of sight. Wesley took a breath. He was aware of the score of soldiers starting to surround him, and probably he could have made a few of them perspire for their victory. But for what point? Wesley sagged. Come, sir, Count Rugen approached. We must get you safely to your ship. We are both men of action, Wesley replied. Lies do not become us. Well spoken, said the Count, and with one sudden swing he clubbed Wesley into insensitivity. Wesley fell like a beaten stone, his last conscious thought being of the Count's right hand. It was 6-fingered, and Wesley could never quite remember having encountered that deformity before. Chapter 6, The Festivities. I'm going to skip through a lot of this. So if you turn to page 222, first we're going to learn what happened to Inigo when he woke up after the duel with the man in black. We find out that Vizzini had told them, go back to the beginning. And where they met was the thieves' quarter in Florin. So he goes back to the thieves' quarter. When he gets back to the thieves' quarter, he notices that Vizzini and Fezzik are not there. He's just waiting for them, and he has nothing else to do. He's really down because someone beat him at a fencing fight or match or whatever you call it, duel. So he's really down. So what does he do? Falls to his weakness, starts to drink. So now he's turning into a drunk again. He starts drinking. Fezzik wakes up from he regains consciousness and doesn't know where to go, runs to find Vizzini, finds Vizzini dead, and can't remember where he's supposed to go. He can't remember to go back to Florin City, to the thieves' quarter in Florin City. So he ends up roaming around. He goes, hides in a cave, and then these village boys come over, and they start to taunt him and tease him when they notice that he's not as tough as he looks, and then they start to throw rocks at him. So he's just sitting in a cave with these village boys taunting him and throwing rocks at him. We are at page 228 then, and we are going to start reading about Wesley, where it says Wesley at the bottom of the page. Wesley awoke chained in a giant cage. His shoulder was beginning to fester from the gnawing and digging that the ROUS had done into his flesh. He ignored his discomfort momentarily to try and adjust to his surroundings. He was certainly underground. It was not the lack of windows that made that sure, more the dankness. From somewhere above him now, he could hear animal sounds, an occasional lion roar, the yelp of a cheetah. Shortly after his return to consciousness, the albino appeared, bloodless, with skin as pale as dying birch. The candlelight that served to illuminate the cage made the albino seem totally like a creature who had never seen the sun. The albino held a tray which carried many things, bandages and food, healing powders, and brandy. "Where are we?" said from Wesley. A shrug from the albino. "Who are you?" Shrug. That was almost the entire extent of the fellow's conversation. Wesley asked question after question while the albino tended and redressed his wounds, then fed him food that was warm and surprisingly good and plentiful. Shrug, shrug. "Who knows I'm here?" Shrug. "Lie, but tell me something. Give an answer. Who knows I'm here?" Whispered. "I know. They know." "They?" Shrug. "The prince and the count, you mean?" Nod. "And that is all?" Nod. "When I was brought in, I was half conscious. The count was giving the orders, but 3 soldiers were carrying me. They know too?" Shake. Whispered. "Knew." "They're dead? That's what you're saying?" Shrug. "Am I to die then?" Shrug. Wesley lay back on the floor of the giant underground cage, watching as the albino silently reloaded the tray, glided from sight. If the soldiers were dead, surely it was not unreasonable to assume that he would eventually follow. But if they wanted his erasure, surely it was also not unreasonable to assume that they had not the least intention of doing it immediately. Else why tend his wounds? Why return his strength with good warm food? No, his death would be a while yet. But in the meantime, considering the personalities of his captors, it was finally not unreasonable to assume that they would do their best to make him suffer greatly. Wesley closed his eyes. There was pain coming, and he had to be ready for it. He had to prepare his brain. He had to get his mind controlled and safe from their efforts so that they could not break him. He would not let them break him. He would hold together against anything and all. If only they gave him sufficient time to make ready, he knew he could defeat pain. It turned out they gave him sufficient time. It was months before the machine was ready, but they broke him anyway. At the end of the 30th day of festivities, with 60 days more of partying to enjoy, Buttercup was genuinely concerned that she might lack the strength to endure. Smile, smile, hold hands, bow and thank, over and over. She was simply exhausted from 1 month. How was she to survive twice that? It turned out, because of the king's health, to be both easy and sad. For with 55 days to go, Lothringen began to weaken terribly. Prince Humperdinck ordered new doctors brought in. There was still the last miracle man alive, Max. But since they had fired him long before, bringing him back on the case now was simply not deemed wise. If he was incompetent then, when Lothringen was only desperately ill, how could he suddenly be a cure-all now, with Lothringen dying? The new doctors all agreed on various tried-and-true medications, and within 48 hours of their coming on the case, the king was dead. The wedding date, of course, was unchanged. It wasn't every day a country had a 500th anniversary, but all the festivities were either curtailed entirely or vastly cut down, and Prince Humperdinck became 45 days before the wedding King of Florin, and that changed everything because before he had taken nothing but his hunting seriously, and now he had to learn everything, learn to run a country, and he buried himself in books and wise men. And how did you tax this, and when should you tax that, and foreign entanglements, and who could be trusted, and how far, and with what? And before her of lovely eyes, Humperdinck changed from a man of fear and action to one of frenzied wisdom, because he had to get it all straight, now, before any other country dared interfere with the future of Florin. So the wedding, when it actually took place, was a tiny thing and brief, sandwiched in between a minister's meeting and a treasury crisis. And Buttercup spent her first afternoon as queen, wandering around the castle, not knowing what in the world to do with herself. It wasn't until King Humperdinck walked out on the balcony with her to greet the gigantic throng that had spent the day in patient waiting that she realized it had happened. She was the queen. Her life, for whatever it was worth, belonged now to the people. They stood together on the castle balcony, accepting the cheers, the cries, the endless thunderous hip-hips, until Buttercup said, "Please, may I walk once more among them?" And the king said with a nod that she might, and down she went again, as on the day of the wedding announcement, radiant and alone. And again the people swept apart to let her pass, weeping and cheering and bowing, and then one person booed. On the balcony watching it all, Humperdinck reacted instantly, gesturing soldiers into the area where the sound had come from, dispatching more troops quickly down and to surround the queen. And like clockwork, Buttercup was safe. The booer apprehended and led away. "Hold a moment," Buttercup said, still shaken by the unexpectedness of what had happened. The soldier who held the booer stopped. "Bring her to me," Buttercup said. In a moment, the booer was right there, eye to eye. It was an ancient woman, withered and bent, and Buttercup thought of all the faces that had gone by in her lifetime, but this one she could not remember. "Have we met?" the queen asked. The old one shook her head. "Then why? Why on this day? Why do you insult the queen?" Because you are not worthy of cheers, the old woman said. And suddenly she was yelling, you had love in your hands and you gave it up for gold. She turned to the crowd. It is true what I tell you. There was love alongside her in the fire swamp and she dropped it from her fingers like garbage. And that's what she is, the queen of garbage. I had given my word to the prince, Buttercup began. But the old woman would not be quieted. And ask how she got through the fire swamp. Ask her if she did it alone. She threw love away to be the queen of grime, the queen of muck. I am old and my life means nothing to me, so I am the only person in all this crowd to dare to tell the truth. And truth says, bow to the queen of feculence if you want to, but not I. Cheer the queen of slime and ordure if you want to, but not I. Rave over the beauty of the queen of cesspools, but not I. Not I. She was advancing on Buttercup now. Take her away, Buttercup ordered. But the soldiers could not stop her, and the old woman kept coming on, her voice getting louder and louder and louder and louder and louder, and Buttercup woke up screaming. She was in bed, alone, safe. The wedding was still 60 days away, but her nightmares had begun. The next night, she dreamed of giving birth to their first child, and this is an interruption. You're going to go all the way to page 238 now. What William Goldman is doing here is just explaining that they did not get married. That was a dream. So she's having nightmares. So he's going to go into her next nightmare now. The next night she dreamed of giving birth to their first child, and it was a girl, a beautiful little girl, and Buttercup said, I'm sorry it wasn't a boy. I know you need an heir. And Humperdinck said, beloved sweet, don't concern yourself with that. Just look at the glorious child God has given us. And then he left, and Buttercup held the child to her perfect breast, and the child said, your milk is sour. And Buttercup said, oh, I'm sorry. And she shifted to the other breast, and the child said, nope, this is sour too. And Buttercup said, I don't know what to do. And the baby said, you always know what to do. You always know exactly what to do. You always do exactly what's right for you, and the rest of the world can go hang. And Buttercup said, you mean Wesley? And the baby said, of course I mean Wesley. And Buttercup explained patiently, I thought he was dead, you see. I gave him my word to your father. And the baby said, I'm dying now. There's no love in your milk. Your milk has killed me. And then the child stiffened and cracked and turned in Buttercup's hands to nothing but dry dust. And Buttercup screamed and screamed even when she was awake again, with 59 days to go until her marriage. She was still screaming. The third nightmare came quickly the following evening, and again it was a baby, this time a son, a marvelous, strong boy. And Humperdinck said, beloved, it's a boy. And Buttercup said, I didn't fail you, thank heavens. And then he was gone, and Buttercup called out, may I see my son now? And all the doctors scurried around outside her royal room, but the boy was not brought in. What seems to be the trouble? Buttercup called out, and the chief doctor said, I don't quite understand, but he doesn't want to see you. And Buttercup said, tell him I am his mother, and I am the queen, and I command his presence. And then he was there, just a handsome baby boy as anyone could wish for. Close it, Buttercup said, and the doctors closed the door. The baby stood in the corner, as far from her bed as he could. Come here, darling, Buttercup said. Why, are you going to kill me too? I'm your mother, and I love you. Now come here. I've never killed anybody. You killed Wesley. Did you see his face in the fire swamp? When you walked away and left him? That's what I call killing. When you're older, you'll understand things. Now, I'm not going to tell you again. Come here. Murder, the baby shouted. Murder! But by then she was out of bed, and she had him in her arms, and was saying, stop that. Stop at this instant. I love you. And was saying, and he said, your love is poison. It kills. And he died in her arms, and she started to cry. Even when she was awake again, with 58 days to go till her marriage, she was still crying. The next night, she simply refused to go to sleep. Instead, she walked and read and did needlework and drank cup after cup of steaming tea from the Indies. She felt sick with weariness, of course, but such was her fear of what she might dream that she preferred any waking discomfort to whatever sleep might have to offer. And at dawn, her mother was pregnant. No, more than pregnant, her mother was having a baby. And as Buttercup stood there in the corner of the room, she watched herself being born, and her father gasped at her beauty, and so did her mother, and the midwife was the first to show concern. The midwife was a sweet woman, known throughout the village for her love of babies, and she said, look, trouble. And the father said, what trouble? Where before did you ever see such a beauty? And the midwife said, don't you understand why she was given such beauty? It's because she has no heart. Here, listen, the baby's alive, but there is no beat. And she held Buttercup's chest against the father's ear, and the father could only nod and say, we must find a miracle, man, to place the heart inside. But the midwife said, that would be wrong, I think. I've heard before of creatures like this, the heartless ones. And as they grow bigger, they get more and more beautiful. And behind them is nothing but broken bodies and shattered souls. And these without hearts are anguish bringers. And my advice would be, since you're both still young, to have another child, a different child, and be rid of this one now. But of course, the final decision is up to you. And the father said to the mother, "Well?" And the mother said, "Since the midwife is the kindest person in the village, she must know a monster when she sees one. Let's get to it." So Buttercup's father and Buttercup's mother put their hands to the baby's throat, and the baby began to gasp. Even when Buttercup was awake again at dawn, with 57 days to go till her marriage, she could not stop gasping. From then on, the nightmares became simply too frightening. When there were 50 days to go, Buttercup knocked one night on the door to the Prince Humperdinck's chambers. She entered when he bid her to. "I see trouble," he said. "You look very ill." And so she did. Beautiful, of course, still that, but in no way well. Buttercup did not see quite how to begin. He ushered her into a chair. He got her water. She sipped at it, staring dead ahead. He put the glass to one side. "At your convenience, Princess," he said. "It comes to this," Buttercup began. "In the fire swamp I made the worst mistake in all the world. I love Wesley. I always have. It seems I always will. I did not know this when you came to me. Please believe what I'm about to say. When you said that I must marry you or face death, I answered, 'Kill me.' I meant that. I mean this now, too. If you say I must marry you in 50 days, I will be dead by morning." The prince was literally stunned. After a long moment, he knelt by Buttercup's chair and in his gentlest voice started to speak. "I admit that when we first became engaged, there was to be no love involved. That was as much as my choice as yours, though the notion may have come from you. But surely you must have noticed in this last month of parties and festivities a certain warming of my attitude." "I have. You have been both sweet and noble." "Thank you. Having said that, I hope you appreciate how difficult this next sentence is for me to say. I would die myself rather than cause you unhappiness by standing in the way of your marrying the man you love." Buttercup wanted almost to weep with gratitude. She said, "I will bless you all my days for your kindness." Then she stood. "So it's settled. Our wedding is off?" He stood too, except for perhaps one thing. "That being?" "Have you considered the possibility that he might not now want any longer to marry you?" Until that moment she had not. "You were, I hate to remind you, not altogether gentle with his emotions in the fire swamp. Forgive me for saying that, beloved, but you did leave him in the lurch in a manner of speaking." Buttercup sat down hard. Her turn now to be stunned. Humperdinck knelt again beside her. "This Wesley of yours, this sailor boy, he has pride?" Buttercup managed to whisper. "More than any man alive, I sometimes think." "Well, consider then, dearest. Here he is, off sailing somewhere with the dread pirate Roberts. He has had a month to survive the emotional scars you dealt him. What if he wants now to remain single, or worse, what if he has found another?" Buttercup was now even beyond whispering. "I think, sweetest child, that we should strike a bargain, you and I. If Wesley wants to marry you still, bless you both. If, for reasons unpleasant to mention, his pride will not let him, then you will marry me, as planned, and be the Queen of Florin." "He couldn't be married, I'm sure, not my Wesley." She looked at the prince. "But how can I find out?" "What about this? You write him a letter telling him everything. We'll make 4 copies. I'll take my 4 fastest ships and order them off in all directions. The dread pirate Roberts is not often more than a month's sail from Florin. Whichever of my ships finds him will run the white flag of truce. Deliver your letter and Wesley can decide. If no, he can speak that message to my captain. If yes, my captain will sail him here to you, and I will have to content myself with somehow a lesser ride." I'm not sure, but I definitely think that is the most generous decision I have yet heard." "Do me this favor then in return. Until we know Wesley's intentions, one way or another, let us continue as we have, so the festivities will not be halted. And if I seem too fond of you, remember that I cannot help myself." "Agreed," Buttercup said, going to the door, but not before she kissed his cheek. He followed her. "Off with you now, and write your letter," and he returned the kiss, smiling with his eyes at her until the corridor curved from his sight. There was no doubt whatsoever in his mind that he was going to seem too fond of her in the days ahead, because when she died of murder on their wedding night, it was crucial that all Florin realize the depth of his love, the epochal size of his loss. Since then, no one would dare hesitate to follow him in the revenge war he was to launch against Gilder. At first, when he hired the Sicilian, he was convinced it was the best that someone else do her in, all the while making it appear the work of soldiers from Gilder. And when the man in black had somehow materialized to spoil his plans, the prince came close to going insane with rage. But now his basically optimistic nature had reasserted itself. Everything always worked out for the best. The people were infatuated with Buttercup now as they had never been before her kidnapping. And when he announced from his castle balcony that she had been murdered, he already saw the scene in his mind. He would arrive just too late to save her from strangling, but soon enough to see the Gilderian soldiers leaping from the window of his bedroom to the soft ground below. When he made that speech to the masses on the 500th anniversary of his country, well, there wouldn't be a dry eye in the square. And although he was just the least bit perturbed, since he had never actually killed a woman before with his bare hands, there was a first time for everything. Besides, if you wanted something done right, you did it yourself. That night, they began to torture Wesley. Count Rugen did the actual pain-inducing. The prince simply sat by, asking questions out loud, inwardly admiring the count's skill. The count really cared about pain. The whys behind the screams interested him as fully as the anguish itself. And whereas the prince spent his life in physically following the hunt, Count Rugen read and studied anything he could get his hands on, dealing with the subject of distress. "All right, now," the prince said to Wesley, who lay in the great fifth-level cage, "before we begin, I want you to answer me this. Have you any complaints about your treatment thus far?" "None whatever," Wesley replied. And in truth, he had none. Oh, he might have preferred being unchained a bit now and then, but if you were to be captive, you couldn't ask for more than he had been given. The albino's medical ministrations had been precise, and his shoulder was fine again. The food the albino brought had always been hot and nourishing, the wine and brandy wonderfully warming against the dankness of the underground cage. "You feel fit, then," the prince went on. "I assume my legs are a little stiff from being chained, but other than that, yes." "Good. Then I promise you this, as God himself is my witness. Answer the next question, and I will set you free this night. But you must answer it honestly, fully, withholding nothing. If you lie, I will know, and then I'll loose the count on you." "I have nothing to hide," Wesley said. "Ask away." "Who hired you to kidnap the princess?" "It was someone from Gilder. We found fabric indicating as much on the princess's horse." "Tell me that man's name, and you are free. Speak." "No one hired me," Wesley said. "I was working strictly freelance, and I didn't kidnap her. I saved her from others who were doing that very thing." "You seem a reasonable fellow, and my princess claims to have known you many years, so I will give you, on her account, one last and final chance. The name of the man in Gilder who hired you. Tell me or face torture." "No one hired me, I swear." The count set fire to Wesley's hands. Nothing permanent or disabling. He just dipped Wesley's hands in oil and brought a candle close enough to set things bubbling. When Wesley had screamed, "No one! No one! No one on my life!" a sufficient number of times, the count dipped Wesley's hands in water, and he and the prince left via the underground entrance, leaving the medication to the albino, who was always nearby during the torturing times, but never visible enough to be distracting. "I feel quite invigorated," the count said as he and the prince began to ascend the underground staircase. "It's a perfect question." He was telling the truth, clearly, we both know that. The prince nodded. The count was privy to all his innermost plans for the revenge war. "I'm fascinated to see what happens," the count went on. "Which pain will be least endurable, the physical or the mental anguish of having freedom offered if the truth is told, then telling it, and being thought a liar?" "I think the physical," said the prince. "I think you're wrong," said the count. Actually, they were both wrong. Wesley suffered not at all throughout. His screaming was totally a performance to please them. He had been practicing his defenses for a month now, and he was more than ready. The minute the count brought the candle close, Wesley raised his eyes to the ceiling, dropped his eyelids over them, and in a state of deep and steady concentration, he took his brain away. Buttercup was what he thought of, her autumn hair, her perfect skin, and he brought her very close beside him and had her whisper in his ear throughout the burning. I love you, I love you. I only left you in the fire swamp to test your love for me. Is it as great as mine for you? Can two such loves exist on one planet at one time? Is there that much room, beloved Wesley?" The albino bandaged his fingers. Wesley lay still. For the first time, the albino started things. Whispered, "You better tell them." From Wesley, a shrug. Whispered, "They never stop, not once they start. Tell them what they want to know and have done with it." Shrug. Whispered, "The machine is nearly ready. They are testing it on animals now." Shrug. Whispered, "It's for your own good I tell you these things." "My own good? What good? They're going to kill me anyway." From the albino, a nod. The prince found Buttercup waiting unhappily outside his chamber doors. "It's my letter," she began. "I cannot make it right." Come in," the prince said gently. "Maybe we can help you." She sat down in the same chair as before. "All right, I'll close my eyes and listen. Read to me." "Wesley, my passion, my sweet, my only, my own. Come back, come back. I shall kill myself otherwise. Yours in torment, Buttercup." She looked at Humperdinck. "Well, do you think I'm throwing myself at him?" "It does seem a bit forward," the prince admitted. "It doesn't leave him a great deal of room to maneuver." "Will you help me to improve it, please?" "I'll do what I can, sweet lady, but first it might help if I knew just a bit about him. Is he really so wonderful, this Wesley of yours?" "Not so much wonderful as perfect," she replied. "Kind of flawless, more or less magnificent, without blemish, rather on the ideal side." She looked at the prince. "Am I being helpful?" "I think emotions are clouding your objectivity just a bit. Do you actually think that there is nothing the fellow can't do?" Buttercup thought for a while. "It's not so much that there's nothing he can't do. It's more that he can do it all better than anyone else can do it." The prince chuckled and smiled. "In other words, for example, you mean if he wanted to hunt, he could out-hunt again, for example, someone such as myself?" "Oh, I would think if he wanted to, he could, quite easily, but he happens not to like hunting, at least to my knowledge, though maybe he does, I don't know. I never knew he was so interested in climbing, mountain climbing, but he scaled the cliffs of insanity under most adverse conditions, and everyone agrees that this is not the easiest thing in the world to accomplish. Well, why don't we just begin our letter with Divine Wesley and appeal to his sense of modesty, the prince suggested. Buttercup began to write and stopped. Does divine begin D-E or D-I? D-I, I believe. Amazing creature, the prince replied, smiling gently as Buttercup commenced the letter. They composed it in 4 hours, and many, many times she said, I could never get through this without you, and the prince was always most modest, asking a little helpful personal questions about Wesley as often as was possible, without drawing attention to it. And in this way, well before dawn, she told him, smiling as she remembered, of Wesley's early fears of spinning ticks. And that night in the 5th level cage, the prince asked, as he was to always ask, Tell me the name of the man in Gilder who hired you to kidnap the princess, and I promise you immediate freedom. And Wesley replied, as he was always to reply, No one. No one. I was alone, and the count, who had spent the day getting the spinners ready, placed them carefully on Wesley's skin. And Wesley closed his eyes and begged and pleaded, and after an hour or so, the prince and the count left, the albino remaining behind with the chore of burning the spinners and then pulling them free from Wesley, lest they accidentally poison him. And on the way up the underground stairs to ground level, the prince said, just for conversation's sake, Much better, don't you think? The count oddly said nothing, which was vaguely irritating to Humperdinck, because to tell the absolute truth, torture was never all that high on his scale of passions, and he was just as soon have disposed of Wesley right then. If only Buttercup would admit that he, Humperdinck, was the better man. But she would not. She simply would not. All she ever talked about was Wesley. All she ever asked about was news of Wesley. Days went by, weeks went by, party after party went by, and all of Florin was moved by the spectacle of their great hunting prince, at last so clearly and wonderfully in love. But when they were alone, all she ever said was, I wonder where could Wesley be? What could be taking him so long? How can I live until he comes? Maddening. So each night the count's discomforts, which made Wesley writhe and twist, were really sort of all right. The prince would manage an hour or so spectating before he and the count would leave, the count still oddly silent. And down below, tending the wounds, the albino would whisper, Tell them, please. They will only add to your suffering. Wesley could barely suppress a smile. He had felt no pain, not once. None. He had closed his eyes and taken his brain away. That was the secret. If you could take your brain away from the present and send it to where it could be completely contemplate skin like wintry cream, well, then let them enjoy themselves. His revenge time would come. Wesley was living now, most of all, for Buttercup. But there was no denying that there was one more thing he wanted, too. His time. Prince Humperdinck simply had no time. There seemed to be not one decision in all of Florin that one way or another didn't eventually come heavily to rest upon his shoulders. Not only was he getting married, his country was having its 500th anniversary. Not only was he noodling around in his mind the best way to get a war going, he also had to constantly have affection shining from his eyes. Every detail had to be met, and met correctly. His father was just no help at all, refusing either to expire or stop mumbling. Keep going. And start making sense. Queen Bella simply hovered around him, translating here and there, and it was with a shock that Prince Humperdinck realized just 12 days before his wedding that he had neglected to set in motion the crucial Gilder section of his plan. So he called Yellin to the castle late one night. Yellin was the chief of all enforcement in Florin City, a job he had inherited from his father. The albino zookeeper, or keeper at the zoo, was Yellin's first cousin, and together they formed the only pair of non-nobles the prince could come close to trusting. Your Highness, Yellin said. He was small but crafty, with darting eyes and slippery hands. Prince Humperdinck came out from behind his desk. He moved close to Yellin and looked carefully around before saying softly, I have heard from unimpeachable sources that many men of Gilder have of late begun to infiltrate our thieves' quarters. They are disguised as Florinese, and I am worried. I have heard nothing of such a thing, Yellin said. A prince has spies everywhere. I understand, said Yellin, and you think, since the evidence points that they tried to kidnap your fiancé once, such a thing might happen again. It's a possibility. I'll close off the thieves' quarters then, Yellin said. No one will enter and no one will leave. Not good enough, said the prince. I want the thieves' quarters emptied and every villain jailed until I am safely on my honeymoon. Yellin did not nod quickly enough, so the prince said, State your problem. My men are not always too happy at the thought of entering the thieves' quarter. Many of the thieves resist change. Root them out. Form a brute squad, but get it done. Takes at least a week to get a decent brute squad going, Yellin said, but that is time enough. He bowed and started to leave. And that was when the scream began. Yellin had heard many things in his life, but nothing quite so eerie as this. He was a brave man, but this sound frightened him. It was not human, but he could not guess the throat of the beast it came from. It was actually a wild dog on the first level of the zoo, but no wild dog had ever shrieked like that before. But then no wild dog had ever been put in the machine. The sound grew in anguish, and it filled the night sky as it spread across the castle grounds, over the walls, even to the great square beyond. It would not stop. It simply hung now below the sky, an audible reminder of the existence of agony. In the great square, half a dozen children screamed back at the night, trying to blot out the sound. Some wept, some only ran for home. Then it began to lessen in volume. Now it was hard to hear in the great square. Now it was gone. Now it was hard to hear on the castle walls. Now it was gone. From the castle walls it shrunk across the grounds toward the first level of the Zoo of Death, where Count Rugen sat fiddling with some knobs. The wild dog died. Count Rugen rose, and it was all he could do to bury his own shriek of triumph. He left the zoo and ran toward Prince Humperdinck's chambers. Yellowm was just going when the Count got there. The prince was seated now behind his desk. When Yellowm was gone and they were alone, the Count bowed to his majesty. "The machine," he said at last, "works." Prince Humperdinck took a while before answering. It was a ticklish situation. Granted, he was the boss, the Count merely an underling. Still, no one in all Florin had Rugen's skills. As an inventor, he had obviously at last rid the machine of all defects. As an architect, he had been crucial in the safety factors involved in the Zoo of Death. And it had undeniably been Rugen who had arranged for the only survivable entrance being the underground fifth level one. He was also supportive to the prince in all endeavors of hunting and battle, and you didn't give a follower like that a quick, "Get away, boy, you bother me." So the prince indeed took a while. "Look, Ty," he said finally, "I'm just thrilled you smoothed out all the bugs of the machine. Never for a minute doubted you'd get it right eventually, and I'm really anxious as can be to see it working. But how can I put this? I can't keep my head above water 1 minute to the next. It's not just the parties and the goo-gooing with what's-her-name. I've got to decide how long the 500th anniversary parade is going to be, and where does it start, and when does it start, and which nobleman gets to march in front of which other nobleman so that everyone's still speaking to me at the end of it. Plus I've got a wife to murder and a country to frame for it, and plus I've got to get a war going once that's all happened, and all this stuff I've got to do myself. Here's what it all comes down to. I'm just swamped, Ty. So how about if you go to work on Wesley and tell me how it goes, and when I get the time I'll come watch, and I'm sure it'll be just wonderful, but for now, what I'd like is a little breathing room. No hard feelings." Count Rugen smiled. None, and there weren't any. He always felt better when he could dole out pain alone. You could concentrate more deeply when you were alone with agony. "I knew you'd understand, Ty." There was a knock on the door, and Buttercup stuck her head in. "Any news?" she said. The prince smiled at her and sadly shook his head. "Honey, I promise to tell you the second I hear a thing." "It's only 12 days, though." "Plenty of time, Dulcet, darling. Now don't worry yourself." "I'll leave you," Buttercup said. "I was going to," the Count said. "May I walk you to your quarters?" Buttercup nodded, and down the corridors they wandered till they reached her suite. "Good night," Buttercup said quickly. Ever since that day he had first come to her father's farm, she had always been afraid whenever the Count came near. "I'm sure he'll come," the Count said. He was privy to all the prince's plans, and Buttercup was well aware of this. "I don't know your fellow well, but he impressed me greatly. Any man who can find his way through the fire swamp can find his way to Florin Castle before your wedding day." Buttercup nodded. "He seems so strong, so remarkably powerful," the Count went on, his voice warm and lulling. "I only wondered if he possessed true sensitivity, as some men of great might, as you know, do not. For example, I wonder, is he capable of tears?" "Wesley would never cry," Buttercup answered, opening her chamber door, "except for the death of a loved one," and with that she closed the Count away, and alone went to her bed and knelt. "Wesley," she thought then, "do come, please. I have begged you in my thoughts, and now these many weeks, and still no word. Back when we were on the farm, I thought I loved you, but that was not love. When I saw your face behind the mask on the ravine floor, I thought I loved you, but that was again nothing more than deep infatuation. Beloved, I think I love you now, and I pray you only give me the chance to spend my life in constant proving. I could spend my life in the fire swamp and sing from morn till night if you were by me. I could spend eternity sinking down through snow sand if my hand held your hand. My preference would be to last eternity with you beside me on the cloud, but hell would also be a lark if Wesley was with me." She went on that way, silent hour after silent hour. She had done nothing else for 38 evenings now, and each time her ardor deepened, her thoughts became more pure. Wesley, Wesley, flying across the 7 seas to claim her. For his part, and quite without knowing, Wesley was spending his evenings in much the same fashion. After the torture was done, when the albino had finished tending his slashes or burns or breaks, when he was alone in the giant cage, he sent his brain to Buttercup, and there it dwelled. He understood her so well. In his mind he realized that moment he left her on the farm. When she swore love, certainly she meant it. But she was barely 18. What did she know of the depth of the heart? Then again, when he had removed his black mask, she had tumbled to him. Surprise had been operating, stunned astonishment as much as emotion. But just as he knew that the sun was obliged to rise each morning in the east, no matter how much a western arisal might have pleased it, so he knew that Buttercup was obliged to spend her love on him. Gold was inviting, and so was royalty, but they could not match the fever in his heart, and sooner or later she would have to catch it. She had less choice than the sun. So when the Count appeared with the machine, Wesley was not particularly perturbed. As a matter of fact, he had no idea what the Count was bringing with him into the giant cage. As a matter of absolute fact, the Count was bringing nothing. It was the albino who was doing the actual work, making trip after trip with thing after thing. That was what it really looked like to Wesley. Things, little soft rimmed cups of various sizes and a wheel, most likely, and another object that could turn out to be either a lever or a stick. It was hard to tell. "A good evening to you," the Count began. He had never to Wesley's memory shown much excitement. Wesley made a very weak nod in return. Actually, he felt about as well as ever, but it didn't do to let that kind of good of news get around. "Feeling a bit under the weather?" the Count asked. Wesley made another feeble nod. The albino scurried in and out, bringing more things, wire-like extensions, stringy and endless. "That will be all," the Count said finally. Nod and gone. "This is the machine," the Count said when they were alone. "I spent 11 years constructing it. As you can tell, I'm rather excited and proud." Wesley managed an affirmative blink. "I'll be putting it together for a while," and with that he got busy. Wesley watched the construction with a good deal of interest and, logically enough, curiosity. "You heard that scream a bit earlier on this evening," another affirmative blink. "That was a wild dog. The machine caused that sound." It was a very complex job the Count was doing, but the 6 fingers on his right hand never for a moment seemed in doubt as to just what to do. "I'm very interested in pain," the Count said, as I'm sure you've gathered these past months. In an intellectual way, actually. I've written, of course, for the most learned journals on the subject, articles mostly. At the present, I'm engaged in writing a book. My book, the book, I hope. The definitive work on pain, at least as we know it now. Wesley found the whole thing fascinating. He made a little groan. "I think pain is the most underrated emotion available to us," the Count said. "The serpent to my interpretation was pain. Pain has been with us always, and it always irritates me when people say as important as life and death, because the proper phrase to my mind should be as important as pain and death." The Count fell silent for a time. Then, as he began and completed a series of complex adjustments, "One of my theories," he said somewhat later, "is that pain involves anticipation. Nothing original, I admit, but I'm going to demonstrate to you what I mean. I will not, underline not, use the machine on you this evening. I could, it's ready and tested, but instead I will simply erect it and leave it beside you for you to stare at the next 24 hours, wondering just what it is and how it works, and can it really be as dreadful as all that?" He tightened some things here, loosened some more over there, and tugged and patted and shaped. The machine looked so silly, Wesley was tempted to giggle. Inside, he groaned again. "I'll leave you to your imagination then," the Count said, and he looked at Wesley. "But I want you to know one thing before tomorrow night happens to you, and I mean it. You are the strongest, the most brilliant and brave, the most altogether worthy creature it has ever been my privilege to meet, and I feel almost sad that for the purposes of my book and future pain scholars, I must destroy you." "Thank you," Wesley breathed softly. The Count went to the cage door and said over his shoulder, "And you can stop all your performing about how weak and beaten you are. You haven't fooled me for a month. You're practically as strong now as on the day you entered the fire swamp. I know your secret, if that's any consolation to you." "Secret?" Hushed, strained. "You've been taking your brain away," the Count cried. "You haven't felt the least discomfort in all these months. You raise your eyes and drop your eyelids, and then you're off, probably with, I don't know, her, most likely. Good night now. Try and sleep. I doubt you'll be able to. Anticipation, remember?" With a wave, he mounted the underground stairs. Wesley could feel the sudden pressure of his heart. Soon the albino came, knelt by Wesley's ear, whispered, "I've been watching you all these days. You deserve better than what's coming. I'm needed. No one else feeds the beasts as I do. I'm safe. They won't hurt me. I'll kill you if you like. That would foil them. I've got some good poison. I beg you. I've seen the machine. I was there when the wild dog screamed. Please let me kill you. You'll thank me. I swear." "I must live," whispered. "But," interruption, "they will not reach me. I am all right. I am fine. I am alive, and I will stay that way." He said the words loud, and he said them with passion. But for the first time in a long time, there was terror. "Well, could you sleep?" the Count asked the next night upon his arrival to the cage. "Quite honestly, no," Wesley replied in his normal voice. I'm glad you're being honest with me. I'll be honest with you. No more charades between us, the Count said, putting down a number of notebooks and quill pens and ink bottles. I must carefully track your reactions, he explained. In the name of science, the Count nodded. If my experiments are valid, my name will last beyond my body. It's immortality I'm after, to be quite honest. He adjusted a few knobs on the machine. I suppose you're naturally curious as to how this works. I have spent the night pondering, and I know no more than when I started. It appears to be a great conglomeration of soft rim cups in infinitely varied sizes, together with a wheel and a dial and a lever, and what it does is beyond me. Also glue, added the Count, pointing to a small tub of thick stuff, to keep the cups attached. And with that he set to work, taking cup after cup, touching the soft rims with glue and setting them against Wesley's skin. Eventually I'll have to put one on your tongue too, the Count said, but I'll save that for last in case you have any questions. This certainly isn't the easiest thing to get set up, is it? I'd be able to fix that in later models, the Count said. At least those are my present plans. And he kept right on putting cup after cup on Wesley's skin until every inch of exposed surface was covered. So much for the outside, the Count said then. This next is a bit more delicate. Try not to move. I'm chained hand, head, and foot, Wesley said. How much movement do you think I'm capable of? Are you really as brave as you sound, or are you a little frightened? The truth, please. This is for posterity, remember? I'm a little frightened, Wesley replied. The Count jotted that down, along with the time. Then he got down to the fine work, and soon there were tiny, tiny, soft-rimmed cups on the insides of Wesley's nostrils, against his eardrums, under his eyelids, above and below his tongue. And before the Count arose, Wesley was covered inside and out with the things. Now all I do, the Count said very loudly, hoping Wesley couldn't hear, is get that wheel going to its fastest spin so that I have more than enough power to operate. And the dial can be set from 1 to 20, and this being the first time, I will set it at its lowest setting, which is 1. And then all I need to do is push the lever forward, and we should, if I haven't gummed it up, be in full operation. But Wesley, as the lever moved, took his brain away. And when the machine began, Wesley was stroking her autumn-colored hair and touching her skin of wintry cream, and then his world exploded. Because the cups were everywhere. And before they had punished his body but left his brain, only not the machine. The machine reached everywhere. His eyes were not his to be controlled, and his ears could not hear her gentle, loving whisper, and his brain slid away, slid far from love into the deep fault of despair, hit hard, fell again, down through the house of agony into the country of pain. Inside and out, Wesley's world was ripping apart, and he could do nothing but crack along with it. The Count turned off the machine then, and as he picked up his notebooks, he said, as you no doubt know, the concept of the suction pump is centuries old. Well, basically, that's all this is, except instead of water, I'm sucking life. I've just sucked away 1 year of your life. Later, I'll set the dial higher, certainly to 2 or 3, perhaps even to 5. Theoretically, 5 should be 5 times more severe than what you've just endured, so please be specific in your answers. Tell me now, honestly, how do you feel? In humiliation and suffering and frustration and anger and anguish so great it was dizzying, Wesley cried like a baby. Interesting, said the Count, and carefully noted it down.